Lord sustains me. And I rise to greet my waiting King. I wait to let His presence fill me. His breath and love my lungs to see.
On behalf of our lead sponsor, the Canadian Bible Society, and our event hosts, Imago and Intricity, welcome to Beauty and Brokenness, an opportunity for us to journey together to Easter with our shared brokenness. As a means of introduction, my name is Alana Walker Carpenter, and I will be your host today. Whether you have a little faith, a lot of faith, or no faith at all, you belong here. For those of you who are engaged on social media, our hashtag is beauty and brokenness. That's beauty and brokenness. And for those who would like to engage in the live Q&A, you can simply click on the right-hand side of your screen and those questions will come directly to us. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our panel today. Firstly, John Franklin, Executive Director of Imago. Mike Jansen, composer, pianist, and songwriter. And I regret to inform you that one of our panelists, Sarah Walker, is unable to make it as she's caring for an ill family member. And Sarah's regrets today remind me that we are simply in and out of seasons of brokenness. So let's get started. John, this first question is to you. Can you describe to us the concept of the Japanese art kintsugi and how this art form connects with our series, Beauty and Brokenness?
Well, thank you, Alana, for that question. Kintsugi is this Japanese art of mending broken pottery. Where there are cracks or breaks in a piece of pottery, lacquer would be used to repair those breaks, and it would be finally painted with either gold or silver. So rather than covering or hiding the breaks, they would be accented. Now, in this way, the artistic practice embraces the flawed and imperfect in the object. To be clear, it's not a celebration of brokenness. That's not what it's about. But rather, it's an acceptance of it and a gesture that visually redeems the broken object, which may end up actually being more beautiful than it was before. That's certainly possible. I think this is an interesting practice to consider in a culture like our culture, where so much is simply disposable. No longer useful, we throw it away. So kintsugi may be a strong symbol of healing or renewal. These, I think, are such important themes for the human journey.
Oh, I agree and concur. They are incredibly important themes. Mike, this next question is for you. How can we not get trapped in portraying a finished product, whether it be a song or a proposal downtown, rather than simply showing up as we are, broken?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency for me too to want to show the finished work. But in the unfinished work, there's often an invitation into others to experience their own brokenness as they listen to a song, as they talk to you. For me, a few years ago, I did an album called Lent on solo piano, and it was at a time in my concussion injury where things weren't that great, and I was waiting and waiting months and then years to get better. And I kept waiting to get better so I could record this album of solo piano pieces. And I thought a little bit about Keith Jarrett, who's a jazz guy, and he wrote a beautiful album, maybe one of my favorites, called The Melody at Night with You. And it was this beautiful album that he wrote when he was going through very serious illness. But it's sparse, it's beautiful, it leaves space for others who are broken to also experience it. And so I suddenly realized maybe I should record my album even though I wasn't feeling that great. So I got this piano, rented it, brought into the studio, and that sort of began the journey of, at first, not being able to do more than 2 or 3 minutes, and then eventually a few hours, but a journey of sort of recording and putting stuff out there that typically I may have played faster and louder and really had it all ready to go. But this was more of a piece where the brokenness showed up in the music.
And Mike, there's a great connection in our brokenness to one another when we're not refined and finished and polished.
Yeah.
John, the next question is quite weighty. What is the theology of brokenness? What is the theology of brokenness?
Well, you're right, Alana. That's a weighty question. Let me come at it this way and say that we've got to first understand what we mean by brokenness. And I'm going to just suggest 2 ways that we can think about it. First, hardship and suffering. I mean, that's one form of brokenness. We may experience anxiety or loneliness, or be afflicted by disease or a bodily impact of an accident. Or we may have been touched by death. We may be unemployed or have lost a friend. So we're speaking here of emotional and physical brokenness that takes the form of suffering and hardship. There's a second kind of brokenness, and that's moral brokenness, what both the biblical narrative and Christian theology refer to as sin. Now, that's an uncomfortable word, but it gets to the heart of the human problem, and it speaks to human practices. It expresses the reality of a broken relationship, the broken relationship between the Creator and the creature. For the first, it's instructive, I think, to look at the Psalms, where its lament and frustration and fear is expressed. But these are undergirded by a confidence in the God of Israel. So hardship and suffering, though present and real, don't have to have the last word. Psalm 31, for example, where the psalmist is distressed and grieving, and it's brought on by oppressive circumstances, he writes, "I've become like a broken vessel." And the psalmist describes how he is spent with sorrow and cries out to God for deliverance. In the latter part of the psalm, interestingly, he shifts to another register, moving from lament to praise, where he speaks of the goodness of God and of what God will accomplish for those who take refuge in him. So what the psalm sets out are 2 contrasting elements of life: the hardship, suffering, and darkness on the one hand, and that we all experience, and then the hopefulness that comes through faith and confidence in who God is. That hopefulness does not eliminate the hardship, but rather it sustains us through it. The brokenness resulting from human oppression and insensitivity is a beauty that comes in the form of hope, bringing light to the darkness. Now, I could say more about the moral brokenness, but maybe I'll leave that for later.
Thanks, John. Hardship, suffering, and darkness do not have the last word. Hardship, suffering, and darkness do not have the last word. And Mike, we know that to be true for you. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to virtually tune in to your Psalms project, the launch of your Psalms project. To me, Mike, this really embodies our beauty and brokenness theme. Tell us about that project.
Yeah, it was really exciting during a pandemic to release the project. I've been working on it off and on for 4.5 years or so. It began a while ago when a good friend of mine, Keith Martin, asked me if I'd ever consider working on that. And at the time I was really busy. I had lots of stuff I wanted to do. And so I said, well, I'd like to some point do it, but I didn't really know when. And then I had this injury where I had a serious concussion that I thought would last a few weeks. It lasted months and then into years. And I became really desperate for something to hang on to, for someone to hang on to. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't talk to people. I couldn't listen to music, couldn't be on the computer. I really couldn't handle any kind of stimulation at all. And so I had to just sit in a dark room with my eyes covered or on a couch for hours at a time. Any kind of motion would just get me too dizzy. And so I began to desperately think of what can I do? And the Psalms were the first thing that came to mind, because there are these guttural, deep cries to God that just say help. And I sort of moved out of the place in the Psalms where I used to read them and think of people who are going through hard things, and suddenly I just saw myself written into every page. And I started, as I'm a musician, I started, making little melodies from these songs. And over the years, I had a little more in the tank, and so I could start to work on the songs more and develop them more. And over a few years, I noticed there was thousands of little demos on my iPhone. And so with some help of friends, because I couldn't do it all, I sort of sifted through them and came up hopefully with the best and started working on them. And then during the pandemic, tried to record them remotely with all my friends joining in. We had a few weeks where we put a string orchestra on. And so, yeah, we just released it a few weeks ago officially, but it's been a real journey for sure.
Mike, it is exquisite. I actually think it's one of the most beautiful things that you've done in your career. And in fact, friends, as you entered to our program this morning, you had an opportunity to listen to some of what Mike has recently produced. So thank you for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
John, you have not escaped from brokenness. Your own mother passed away at 2, and your father at 9. How did God provide for you during that season when you felt so alone and abandoned?
Well, thank you, Alana. I'm not often asked that question. Most people don't know this about my own background. I was, of course, very young, and I know those losses impacted me. And I've never been entirely clear in just what ways I was affected. Death is not something that any of us can manage. So it falls to us to accept it. Now, you asked about God's provision for me. Well, I think God's provision showed up in 2 ways. I have no recollections of my mother, but eventually I had a stepmother who was a devout in her faith and also generous in her love. So she was a gift from God. The other provision came in the form of church connections. And I smile as I think of this. There were 3 churches within a block of where I lived. And I attended all 3 for Sunday school and often would go to the services as well. My faith was well nurtured as a child, and my sense of God was strong. And I didn't think of God as having to serve my expectations. So when you lose a parent, what I knew is that I was called to be faithful to God, to following Jesus. And of course, my sense of what that meant was very limited, but it allowed me to accept life as it came. And I think that's what sustained me.
Oh, John, there are so many nuggets. There's the gift of acceptance, the reality of knowing that death is not something we can manage. We need help. And God provided for you in the form of a stepmother, in a form of a healthy church community. Where your faith was nurtured.
Right.
And I also like that you didn't have these expectations. And so often we have these expectations. And so grateful for those nuggets that you've just shared, John. Mike, our brokenness often impacts others. I'm fully aware of that from my own brokenness. Describe to us how your journey, that lengthy journey of 4.5 years, impacted others.
Yeah, I think, although I went through a lot in the 4.5 years, as you probably know, Alana, it's often the loved ones around us who maybe take the biggest beating, because usually with an injury or an illness, people know that you have that. And so there's permission. In my case, there was a lot of permission to rest. But it was a lot harder on friends who wanted to hang out, but I just actually couldn't. They wanted to go out for a quick coffee. They wanted to talk on the phone. They wanted to do all this fun stuff, and I just couldn't do any of it. So I think it took a toll on that for sure, even though I have amazing friends. And my family probably took a big hit as well. Right when I had the concussion, my wife was pregnant, and we'd been waiting for a long time for that. And she had to sort of go through life, without a husband, for that whole beautiful stretch of time where, you tell people that you're pregnant, usually. So I wasn't there for that. And then never mind just taking care of her. I remember even the night before we went to the hospital, she said to me, okay, you go rest and I'll be down here on the couch and I'll let you know when it's time to go to the hospital. And, she had to carry a very big burden the whole time that I had this injury. And even just, debriefing with your spouse at the end of a day, she would look over at me and I had that look in my eyes. I couldn't handle anything. And she would just have to, go to bed or read a book and not really be able to talk to someone. So I think it can be a very lonely journey for those who are going with us. My daughters too. My oldest daughter was 5 at the time, and it's hard to explain why you can't go to the playground, why you can't go to her dance recital, you can't do all this stuff, or even just hang out and play a game. You can't do that. So it's pretty hard to describe that. And luckily there's grace in these circumstances. But Alana, you went through an injury as well. I'm curious to see what you would say about that.
Yeah, Mike, as you're sharing, I can feel myself welling up with emotion thinking about all the people that sacrificed on my behalf. I particularly think about my parents, my husband, and my son. And I had to take a year off work, which was hard to swallow. And my injury was January 23rd. And I remember in June just finding our son on the kitchen floor, just sobbing, just saying, I want my mom back. I want my mom back. I want my mom back. Fully knowing that there was nothing I could do. I still had to check in for rest, and just so desiring, wanting to care for all those that were caring for me. And to me, that was really the ultimate trust and surrender. John, when I think of brokenness, I think about many of the relationships that have been strained during this pandemic. There's family relationships and friendships, even our neighbors and our colleagues. How do we even begin to restore broken relationships? We've talked a lot about restoration of the economy, but I'm thinking about in the lens of relationships and the restoration that needs to happen there too.
Yes, Alana, that's a challenging question, but restoration of broken relationships is not an easy matter. And that's not least because we as human beings are very complex creatures. I think that the process of restoration calls for humility. I think that's hugely important. It calls for patience. It calls for love. And effectively, I guess we could say it calls for what the scriptures call the fruit of the Spirit. We also need transparency and honesty. Very often the breaks in a relationship come from misunderstanding, or it may be the result of a failure to listen or a failure to be empathetic. And, well, I think we need to face up to the fact that probably the greatest obstacle that gets in the way of restoration of relationships is pride. Our resistance to accepting responsibility. That's a tough obstacle for us to get over. Our failure to acknowledge our part in the process. And so the relationship remains strained. So if we could have some of that fruit of the Spirit, that humility and patience and love and the capacity to listen and be empathetic, enter into the other person's life in some way, I think we would do well to bring some healing to broken relationships.
John, I concur with that. So much of it starts with ourselves. So much of it starts with ourselves. And you're right, going back to the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Mike, this next question is for you. As we journey to Good Friday, I cannot help but think about our willingness to wait, or maybe our willingness not to wait in our brokenness. What does it mean from your experience to wait on God?
Well, waiting is not fun. Often we want to make things happen. My personality often in life is I'm a go-getter, so I like to make things happen. And I rely a lot on sort of what I'm good at, and I try to use that. And make things happen. But when something happens, when you have to wait, and Lent is all about wait, the March to Good Friday, it's all about reordering our desires, our appetites into the right orders. And so often we take a break from things so that we're filled with the right things. And I think waiting does that. It takes the emphasis off of ourselves. We're forced to come to grips with that we're not as in charge as we think, that God is actually in charge, and there's a bigger picture in life. Waiting also, I really think, develops trust in us. Without waiting, it's, when we have to wait for something, we have to trust it's going to come. And so I think it really develops that relationship, especially with God. And I also think, I just think it takes off the idea of of what we do, and it puts the emphasis back on who we are, who God is, who we are in God, rather than, what we do, what we have to offer the world, what we have to offer our businesses, our workplaces. When we're sort of have to let go of all that, we realize, oh, wait a minute, there's a bigger thing at work here, and it's who we are actually.
Mike, such poignant words. And waiting on God is so hard. When someone's struggling, I often simply say to them, I'm waiting with you. I'm waiting with you. John, if Jesus had to suffer to live obediently to his call, how much more do we need to suffer as a society? Could this not have just been all taken care of at the cross?
Yeah, that's a question I think a lot of people ask and wonder about. There is a sense, Alana, in which it has all been taken care of at the cross, but not yet. There is that promise that all things will be made new, but that's a day still coming. So we are lodged in this place that you were just talking about, that Mike was talking about, of waiting. We're waiting and waiting. But the restoration of the world is something we all long for. And there's a sense in which we who are followers of Jesus are called to bring the future into the present as much as possible. So we try to bring that time of restoration when all things are made new. In small ways, we try to bring it into the present. But suffering and pain and darkness is woven into the fabric of life. I mean, there's no way to escape it. And this is why God comes to us in Jesus and has to go through that suffering. It's part of the very nature of reality, given our fallenness, the breach of our relationship with God. So it's not something we can escape, but it's something, again, that doesn't have the last word. Something that we can negotiate our way through by God's grace.
I love what you said. It's not something that we can escape. And so often people try to escape pain and suffering. John, I'm going to give you a follow-up question there. From my experience as a leader, people really struggle with this whole concept of brokenness and suffering. Why does somebody get more, somebody get less? Any thoughts in regards to that?
Yeah, I understand the question, and I will say that our inclination, certainly in the Western culture, or perhaps simply as human beings, is always to look for explanations of things. Mm-hmm. And we can't always give an explanation. We need to have a posture of receptivity and say, this is the way the world is. This is what we've got to accept. Now, what do we do about it? The real issue, and I think Mike alluded to this, is not so much what we think about it or how we try to explain it, but rather how do we respond to it? How do we respond to the reality? And it's through suffering. Suffering, I think, is a portal to deep beauty. And we have a tendency to be triumphalistic, to want to solve things quickly, immediately. I'd like the solution right now. To put it in terms of the Easter weekend, we want Sunday, Easter Sunday right now. We're not too happy with Good Friday or Holy Saturday waiting in between. We don't like that. We want Easter Sunday now. And although it's come, it's an already, but it's a not yet because there is still more to come. And that's when all creation will be made new. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I don't think we can really say why some people have more suffering than others. I often wonder why I've had so little.
John, it's a fair response. I myself haven't been able to really articulate the answer either. So I think we can all just simply continue to wrestle with that question. And that's what makes us human. You did share a couple of really poignant points there, John. One is we can't control the situation, but we can control our response. We can't control the situation, but we can control our response. Also, I loved what you said about just our suffering is our portal to beauty. Our suffering is our portal to beauty. And I do agree with you. I think so often people want that Easter Sunday. They want that comfort without experience that uncomfiness. And that's just a reflection of society. Mike, this next question is for you. You are an artist, used to performing in front of lots of people, and you and I have had the privilege of collaborating on a number of projects together, which has been such an incredible joy on my part. How and when were you able to relinquish control? And I'm particularly thinking about so many people during the pandemic, Mike, that have really struggled with letting go.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic has been the great equalizer where, we all suddenly are confronted with this question of like, we can't control this. I think so much is fluid and changing, and you feel quite helpless at times with what's going to happen in the future, what's work going to look like, what are we going to do for family vacations? So many things we have to sort of struggle and wrestle with. And I don't think, to answer your question, I'd like to think over 4.5 years, I figured out how to let go of control, but I'm pretty quick to pick up control again now that I'm feeling a little better. So I think it's a natural tendency to sort of want to control events. And I think in a pandemic or an injury, or you're actually forced to change how you do things, you sometimes are actually forced to just let go of control and realize I wasn't in control as I thought I was. And you know what? I don't know how I'm going to get out of this, but God's near me. He's with me. He's holding me. He loves me. I'm known, forgiven. I'm going to make it out okay. And however the circumstances work themselves out, good will come of this.
Mike, so appreciate your answer. And I have to fully confess, I tried to hold on to control for as long as I could. And I remember being upstairs, resting in bed, bursting into tears, and just finally surrendering and saying, I guess you're in control. Like there is just nothing I can do. It is not in my own strength. John, during communion, we often hear the words, "This is my body broken for you." I think words can sometimes become a little too familiar that we actually lose the meaning. John, what is the essence of those words? This is my body broken for you.
Yeah, we certainly can lose the depth of meaning when words are too familiar. Jesus' brokenness for us is really saying that God has chosen to enter into our situation and take upon himself the brokenness of humanity. So there's a God with us moment here, that God is with us in our brokenness. And this is the divine solution, if you like, for human brokenness, for Jesus to come and then actually be broken on our behalf. And it's a brokenness at a very, very deep level. And again, it becomes a portal to something more significant. The beauty, and we haven't said much about beauty here today, but the beauty that the Christian faith points to is a broken beauty. It's not an idealized beauty. It's not a sentimental beauty. It's not a superficial beauty. It's a deep and abiding and even profound beauty. And the road to it is through suffering. I mean, some of the most beautiful moments in life are in the context of suffering, and where love is able to prevail and somehow sustain us in the midst of that. or the restoration of relationships that we were talking about a few moments ago. These are some of the most significant moments in life. And that's the beauty I think we long for, but it goes through this portal of brokenness and
I love,
suffering.
yeah, I love that, John. I would concur. I think some of life's most beautiful moments are in our own suffering and in journeying in the suffering of others. Mike, what does it mean to have so much taken away from you, but yet be given so much?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a great deal of gratitude. When you're helpless and people help you out. I remember one time even John Franklin lined up down the street in his car dropping off food. When people are quick to help you out and sustain you, I mean, a musician, you can imagine how they need to be sustained for 4 years of living in Toronto. There's a great deal of gratitude to those around me, around our family who somehow kept us going. It's a humbling experience, but it's filled with gratitude, not humiliation. When we accept what others are going to give us, what they want to give us, it's humbling, and hopefully it builds generosity back. So I feel like us as a family and myself, we've just been given a tremendous gift by receiving all the generosity and help that others have given us.
I love that posture, Mike, of generosity and gratitude. And I remember somebody saying to me, Alana, don't rob others of their joy in being able to give to you. For years, you've been giving to others, enable them that same joy that you have derived in your own giving. Mike, how does being broken make us more effective as leaders?
Well, I think it makes us approachable. And I'd really encourage all of us. I mean, I think this is a great season in the pandemic to allow the brokenness we're all experiencing, the loneliness we're all experiencing, allow that to come out in our relationships with others, even if you're in charge, if you're a leader. And as you do that, what happens as we're vulnerable with each other is other people feel vulnerable back. It builds trust, just like it does with God. And it really makes us much more approachable as leaders. But Alana, I'm curious to see what you would say, because you work a lot more in the field with leaders.
Yeah, Mike, I look at the beginning of my leadership journey, and I'm almost embarrassed to say I was just so caught up in being perfect. And then I realized that people really can't relate to perfect people. There's just no relating capacity. And the more I let my guard down a little bit, and the more I appropriately shared my story and my brokenness, that's where the deep connection comes from. It doesn't come from any of the perceived success and accolades. So maybe one of the key takeaways for all of us today is just to have that confidence and grace to share a little bit more of who we are to others. Mike and John, we've had a couple of questions come in from our live Q&A, and I want to make sure we get to those. So the first question I'm actually going to give to you, John. It says, with regards to broken relationships, what role does forgiveness play, especially when it is not spoken? I'll say it one more time for you, John. With regards to broken relationships, what role does forgiveness play, especially when it is not spoken?
Yeah, I think forgiveness, well, and not spoken. I mean, I think forgiveness plays a huge role. I mean, if you have been hurt or offended by someone, it's very important that you exercise forgiveness of that person. And what I would say, that if you don't forgive them, you live under their tyranny. That is to say, you'll be upset with them, you'll be angry with them, and that will have a negative impact on you. So I think forgiveness also should be spoken, but of course it depends on the circumstances. But we can have a forgiving spirit and a forgiving heart. And I think that what that does is release us and frees us from the tension and the bondage that the situation might have for us. I don't know if that's...
No, yeah. John, that's great. And I agree. I think it does release us and it frees us. Fascinating. I was having a leadership conversation with a friend of mine who's on an executive team of a well-known brand. She doesn't particularly have a faith background, but she felt that forgiveness should be part of the core competencies of the organization because, in her perception, it enables you to move on. So, just looking at it from her lens was fascinating for
I
me.
think that's true. I think that's true.
Mike, this next question from one of our guests today, I'll pull over to you. It says, how does hidden or buried brokenness manifest in us? How does hidden or buried broken manifest in us?
Right. Well, I'm led to one of the Psalms that I wrote on was Psalm 32. And it talks about when I kept silent, my inside eroded or it wasted away. So I think things that are kept hidden, I think they need, again, as John said, it needs to be shared with the right person and people who are accepting and who you know are trustworthy. But I think as we allow it to be unburied and come out, we're healed. And as we bury it and keep it inside, it finds its way out in the most unlikely times and the most unlikely ways, sometimes through anger, bitterness, a lot of other things, and it actually removes us from people and from God. So I think the challenge as humans is to try to keep open. And what I love about the Psalms is it allows us permission, allows us just to bear everything before God, knowing that He can take it. It's not, nothing is a surprise, and in fact, He'd love to hear from us, whatever it is.
I love that, Mike. The Psalms really is a permission slip. The Psalms really is a permission slip. You know, Mike, as you were talking, you know, one of the things that keeps me up at night is thinking about those that suffer on their own, those who are suffering in silence, and what we can do to connect in with them to make them feel less lonely on their journey. John and Mike, I'll allow either one of you to pick up on this next question. It's how do we let our kids or the next generation walk and learn from their brokenness instead of trying to fix their hurt in brokenness? John, do you want to start, and then we'll pass the baton over to Mike?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we must do is to be transparent about our own brokenness. I mean, there's a tendency for us as human beings not to accept our humanity. That's why we like to hide the brokenness. And in religious settings, there's a tendency for us not to hide the to actually hide the brokenness, because we think we have to be spiritual or perfect or whatever. And we don't realize the value of human brokenness and acknowledging it in terms of taking us to a better place. So I think we have to let children endure their own brokenness, whether it's they've got a thing about anger or pride or their whatever it may be, and let them deal with it. But the really important thing is that it's not just they that have an issue, but we do too. And when they see us being vulnerable, that will model for them the willingness to be vulnerable as well.
I love that. We keep getting questions coming in, so I'm actually going to defer to the next question. But I love that. We have a responsibility in that all. We have a responsibility. Mike, this next one is actually directed to you. Could you say something about the challenges artists have in speaking about their brokenness through their art forms and community being understood, misunderstood, or even ignored?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's John touched on it a little bit. I think in general, in general, we do value vulnerability and brokenness in art, I think. And I've noticed, I've been looking at Spotify playlists and a lot, and I do notice there's a lot of like sort of the new Taylor Swift album and a bunch of other albums where artists are really putting their brokenness out there and talking about brokenness a lot. So I think we've moved away from, let's not talk about it, which I really value. I think Facebook, I see friends, on the day where we talk about issues and depression, people are starting to post things, different artist friends of mine, and, it really encourages others. Instead of seeing this like perfect Facebook image, suddenly they're like, oh, wait a minute. So this person who posts these gorgeous, awesome pictures and where life is going so well, they actually struggle. Oh, and suddenly Facebook becomes a platform of resonance rather than of I gotta stay away from this. So I think there is much more permission for artists to speak about brokenness. Sometimes, as John said, in the church, I think it's still sometimes shied away from. But it's changing. It's changing on the kinds of songs we sing. I think there's maybe a holy discontentment among people sometimes who even leave church, that they wish the church was a bit more real, and that some of the art and the songs represented there would sort of represent a bit more of what they're struggling with.
And one of the quotes that I love outside of the Bible comes from Gandhi. He says, "Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see." And our responsibility of just modeling what we want to see. This last question is for both of you, John and Mike. What Bible verse has provided you the greatest hope in and amongst your own brokenness? Mike.
I've got a bunch, but I'm going to turn to the Psalms. Psalm 131. It talks about, "My heart is not proud, my eye is not haughty. I don't concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me, but I've calmed and quieted myself. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content." And I think that one to me has meant a lot over the last years, because there's just so many times I kept seeing all my friends doing so well at music, and inwardly I was just like dying, because I was like, oh, I wish I was doing this. I wish I could be making albums. I wish I could be out there. And I just felt like I was falling behind or falling down the ladder or whatever it is, superficially. But at the same time, there's this real, in Psalm 131, there's this picture of contentment, because through the darkest night, we've been fed. And it makes me think of hunger. It makes me see in myself the kinds of hunger I don't like, sort of this insatiable, consuming hunger that makes me try to get ahead. But then it shows a hunger that's satisfied, and satisfied in God and in Christ. And that's something that isn't coming from us, but it brings true contentment.
Thank you, Mike. John.
Yeah, I think, Mike, what you just said is really important, that we have to find a place of contentment. One of the risks with our brokenness is that we love it too much and hang on to it. Brokenness is something we need to acknowledge and embrace in a very realistic and transparent way, but it's not a place to live all the time. We don't sort of live in our brokenness, we live with hope. And even though suffering comes to us, as I say, it's not the final word. As for a text, Alana, I thought a bit about this as once you asked us about this a little earlier. And a text that I often think of is one from Philippians, where Paul, speaking of Christ, says that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable to his death. I think that's part of the Christian journey. That's part of our pilgrimage, that we should know the fellowship of the sufferings of Christ as well as knowing the power of the resurrection.
Thank you, John and Mike. And I will add Psalm 34:18. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and the crushed in spirit. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and crushed in spirit. Well, friends, our time has come to an end. I want to thank our lead sponsor, the Canadian Bible Society, for collaborating with us on Beauty and Brokenness, A Journey to Easter. For both of you, John and Mike, for showing up so beautifully, so raw, so honest, so vulnerable, and modeling what we want to see, just sharing a portion of yourself with others. This session has been taped and will be on both Imago and Intricity's website. So that's www.imago/arts.org and www.intricity.ca. We invite you to our second winter series, Beauty and Brokenness, next week, when we're going to be looking at on being in between. We'll be once again joined by John, the executive director of Imago. We'll be joined by Lila Baeli, singer, songwriter, and pianist, and Dave Addison, mental health advocate and in between. A few other things that we just simply want to bring to your attention. The Ontario Prayer Breakfast is on March 29th. You can register at www.ontarioprayerbreakfast.ca. We invite you to save the date for Crossings in 2022, an informative and innovative arts exhibition. You can learn more at www.crossingstoronto.com. And for those of you who would like to purchase one or more of Mike's CDs, including the Psalms Project, you can visit him at his website at www.mikejansen.ca. In closing, friends, our own suffering is lonely. It can be excruciating. It can be painful. It is much like our Savior endeavored. And so as we continue our journey from Good Friday to that Saturday in between, be assured that your wounds and your scars are beautiful to our King. Thank you for joining us.
I wake because the Lord sustains me. And I rise to greet my waiting King. I wait to let His presence fill me.